The stone was wrong. Tessavrin Kale pressed her sampling claw against the exposed cliff face and felt the vibration travel through her forelimb into the dense cartilage of her chest. The resonance was all wrong. 80,000 years of tectonic activity should have folded this basalt into compressed laminate, brittle and dry, shot through with fracture lines from thermal cycling. Instead, the rock hummed. It was warm. It conducted energy the way living tissue conducted blood, and when she pulled her claw back, the surface she had scored healed itself in under 3 seconds. She stared at the scratch disappearing into smooth black stone, and felt the first crack open in everything she understood about planetary geology. Kale, Commander Vashen's voice cut through her helmet calm, tight with the particular strain of a military officer who had stopped understanding his situation 2 hours ago and was running on procedural habit. Report your position. Western Ridge, Stratum 7. Commander, the lithosphere has been engineered. A pause. Repeat that. The lithosphere, the planet's crust, it has been engineered. The basalt is threaded with a molecular repair lattice I cannot identify. This is not natural geology. Someone rebuilt this mountain from the mantle up. Another pause, longer this time. She could hear Vashen breathing through his teeth, the way drevari officers did when they were calculating whether a situation had crossed from manageable to catastrophic. Get back to the landing zone, he said, now. Tessavrin did not get back to the landing zone. She was a geologist, and the mountain was speaking to her in a language she had spent her entire career learning to read, and what it was saying was impossible, and she needed to understand it before anyone ordered her to stop listening. She climbed higher. The first anomaly had been the soil. Tessavrin had knelt at the base of the mountain 2 hours ago and scooped a handful of regolith into her sampling tray, expecting the dead mineral grit of an uninhabited world. What she got was a substrate so rich in bioavailable nutrients that her tray's chemical analyzer flagged it as engineered growth medium. Soil does not organize itself into layered nutrient gradients. Soil does not maintain a consistent pH across a 40-kilometer survey transect. Someone had built this dirt the way an architect builds a foundation, and that realization had driven her up the cliff face with the obsessive focus of a researcher who smells a discovery that will rewrite textbooks. The second anomaly was the water. A thin stream crossed the trail at the 400-meter mark, and when Tessavrin tested it, the mineral content matched nothing in her database. The water was carrying dissolved silicates in a ratio that should have been geologically impossible silicates that were feeding the molecular lattice in the surrounding rock, maintaining its structural integrity the way blood feeds bone. The mountain was not just engineered. It was alive in a functional, metabolic sense. It had a circulatory system. The third anomaly was what finally made her call Vashen, and it was the one that frightened her. At Stratum 7, she found tool marks. Not crude tool marks, not the scratches of primitive excavation. Precision marks, nanometer scale, made by instruments that could manipulate stone at the molecular level. The marks were old, her dating equipment estimated between 8 and 12,000 years, but the stone around them had been maintained, repaired. The lattice had grown over the tool marks and incorporated them into its structure, the way a tree grows around a fence post. Someone had been working on this mountain for millennia, and the mountain had been growing around the work, absorbing it, making it part of itself. That was when the stone healed her scratch. That was when she understood that she was not studying geology. She was studying something that had passed beyond geology into a discipline that did not exist yet. The drevari remnant fleet had dropped out of fold space above this world 19 hours ago, and in those 19 hours, Tessavrin Kale had watched her understanding of the universe dismantle itself one reading at a time. The fleet, 11 ships, the last operational formation of the drevari 6th Expeditionary Armada, had come here because the old navigation charts said this was a dead world, a waypoint. a refueling coordinate logged 80,000 years ago during the Drevari expansion campaigns, back when the armada had numbered 900 vessels, and the drevari had controlled a corridor of space spanning 41 star systems. That corridor was gone now. The 41 systems belonged to other powers, or to no one, or to the slow entropy of civilizations that had risen and fallen while the Sixth Armada drifted in fold space, caught in a navigational recursion loop that should have killed them all but instead preserved them in a kind of temporal amber, aging at 1/10 normal rate while 80 millennia passed outside. They had emerged to find their empire erased, their homeworld colonized by a species that had never heard of the drevari, their language dead. Their star charts useless except for this one entry, a minor planet on the far edge of the old corridor, catalogued as a primitive biosphere with no strategic value, flagged in the Armada's database as waypoint 7761 tertiary. Atmosphere breathable, dominant species pre-tool, no threat assessment required. The planet was called Earth in the database. The dominant species was called human. Vashan had chosen it because it was the only coordinate in their charts that was not already occupied by someone who might shoot at them. 11 ships, 4,000 crew, no functioning weapon systems, fuel reserves at 11%. They needed a quiet place to land, repair, refuel, and decide what to do with the rest of their lives now that their civilization had ended while they slept. What they found when they dropped out of fold space was not a quiet place. Tessavrin had been on the bridge when the orbital scans came in. She remembered the moment with the kind of clarity that attaches itself to the instant before comprehension arrives. The scan officer, a young drevari named Pelith, barely old enough to have earned his station markings, had stared at his display for 11 seconds without speaking. Then he had turned to Commander Vashan and said, in a voice stripped of every emotion except raw confusion, "Sir, the planet is occupied." "By what?" Vashan had asked. Pelith had not answered. He had simply routed his display to the main view screen, and the bridge had gone silent. The planet below them was not a primitive biosphere. It was a fortress. Orbital platforms ringed the equator in a continuous band of metal and energy, each one large enough that Tessavrin's geology-trained eye instinctively categorized them as artificial moons. Between the platforms, traffic moved ships, thousands of ships, ranging from small atmospheric craft to vessels that dwarfed the largest drevari warship ever built. The planet's surface, visible through gaps in cloud cover, was a mosaic of vast urban structures and engineered landscapes that glowed with contained power even in daylight. Mountain ranges had been reshaped, coastlines straightened. Entire continents showed the geometric patterning of a civilization that had moved past building on the land and started building the land itself. And in high orbit, directly between the remnant fleet and the planet, hung something that was not a ship and not a station, and not anything Tessavrin had a word for. It was a structure so large that the view screen could not display it in full. It curved away in both directions like the inner surface of a ring, and its hull, if hull, was the right word for something that seemed to incorporate living stone and flowing metal and light that behaved like a solid, pulsed with a slow, rhythmic energy that Tessavrin's instruments read as a heartbeat. The heartbeat of a planet that had been awake for 80,000 years, preparing for something, growing into something, becoming something that no geological or civilizational model in the drevari database could account for. Vashan had given the order to hold position, no aggressive moves, no active scanning, transponders open, weapons offline, not that the weapons worked anyway. 11 broken ships hanging in the dark above a world that could swat them like dust motes, waiting. The humans had responded in 14 minutes. Not with weapons, not with warnings, with a single ship that detached from one of the orbital platforms and rose to meet them, smooth and unhurried, broadcasting on a frequency that the remnant fleet's ancient communication systems could barely receive. The message, when their translators finally parsed it, was 3 sentences long. "We see you. You are not a threat. Identify yourselves and state your need." Not "who are you?" Not "why are you here?" State your need. As though the humans had looked at 11 battered ships with dead weapons and failing power cores, and already understood everything, except the specific request. Vashan had identified the fleet. He had stated their need: landing permission, repairs, fuel, time. The human response had come in 4 minutes: landing coordinates for a mountainous region on the planet's northern continent. Atmospheric corridor cleared. A ground team would meet them. And now Tessavrin was climbing a mountain that had been rebuilt from the inside out, her geological instruments producing readings that contradicted 80,000 years of drevari planetary science. And the rock beneath her claws was warm and alive and healing itself. And she could not stop climbing because the mountain was the most extraordinary thing she had ever touched, and she was a geologist, and this was what geologists did. At the 500-meter mark, her resonance scanner picked up something that stopped her cold. A harmonic. Deep, rhythmic, and unmistakably artificial, a pulse traveling through the rock at a frequency her instruments barely registered. She pressed the scanner flat against the cliff face and listened with her whole body, the way drevari geologists were trained to listen, through the dense cartilage that ran from sternum to spine and acted as a natural seismometer. The pulse was coming from below, from deep below, kilometers, possibly tens of kilometers, traveling upward through the lattice like blood through an artery. It had a cadence, not random, not the stuttering of natural geothermal activity, but measured, intentional, a heartbeat or a countdown or a signal. She could not determine which, because every analytical framework she possessed was built for dead rock, and this rock was not dead. This rock was thinking. Her scanner spiked. A secondary harmonic joined the first, then a third, the 3 frequencies braiding together into a chord that vibrated through the cliff face and into her claws and up through her forelimbs and into the cartilage where she processed her deepest sensory input. The chord was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, and it was coming from a mountain on a planet that her people had dismissed as worthless, and it was telling her something she did not yet have the vocabulary to understand. She kept climbing. She reached the ridgeline at the 700-meter mark and stopped. The valley below her opened like a wound in the earth, and it was full of her people. The 11 ships of the remnant fleet sat on the valley floor in a rough formation, their hulls scorched and pitted from 80,000 years of fold space drift. They looked ancient. They looked like relics. Around them, the human ground team had erected a perimeter of low structures that Tessavrin's eye read as a combination of medical stations, power relay points, and communication hubs. The structures were modular, elegant, assembled from materials that caught the afternoon light with the deep luster of engineered stone. They had not been there when the fleet landed 9 hours ago. The humans had built an entire support installation in the time it took Tessavrin to hike up a mountain. Beyond the valley, the mountains continued in every direction, and every one of them was wrong. Not in the way that damaged or polluted landscapes were wrong. Wrong in the way that a painting was wrong when you realized it was actually a window. The peaks were too symmetrical, the ridgelines too purposeful. The geological strata, which should have been the chaotic record of 80 millennia of plate tectonics and erosion, were instead organized, layered with the deliberate precision of an archive, as though the humans had taken the raw geology of the planet and rewritten it into something functional. Something that served a purpose Tessavrin could sense but not name. She sat on the ridgeline and pulled out her field kit. The sampling claw, the resonance scanner, the portable spectrometer. The tools of her profession, designed for dead rock on dead worlds, suddenly inadequate for a planet that was more alive than anything she had encountered in her career. The spectrometer confirmed what her hands had already told her. The basalt was laced with a carbon silicate lattice that functioned as both a structural reinforcement and an energy distribution network. The lattice extended downward through every stratum she could scan at least 12 kilometers into the crust, probably deeper. It was drawing geothermal energy from the mantle and distributing it through the mountain's mass in a pattern that her instruments identified as defensive. The mountain was a weapon, or a shield, or both. Tesavrin could not tell, because the engineering was so far beyond her frame of reference that she was essentially a Bronze Age potter trying to analyze a fusion reactor. "You are reading the lattice correctly," said a voice behind her. Tesavrin spun on the ridgeline, her hind claws scrabbling for purchase on the engineered stone. A human stood 10 meters away, on a shelf of rock that Tesavrin was certain had been empty 30 seconds ago. The human was a woman, tall, lean, dressed in a close-fitting jacket of dark material that moved like fabric but caught the light like polished mineral. Her hair was gray, cropped short, and her face had the weathered quality of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. She was watching Tesavrin with an expression of calm interest, the way one professional watches another professional encounter unfamiliar material. "The lattice runs through the entire northern range," the woman continued. 86,000 kilometers of integrated defensive geology. It took us about 12,000 years to complete. Tesavrin's translator struggled with the numbers. 12,000 years to rebuild a mountain range from the mantle up. "Who are you?" Tesavrin asked. "My name is Marin Aldrich. I am the regional geologist for the Northern Shield Territories." She paused. "You are the geologist from the Drevari fleet. How did you know?" "Because you climbed a mountain instead of staying with your ship, and you brought a spectrometer instead of a weapon." Marin Aldrich's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement of kinship, one rock reader recognizing another. "I would have done the same thing." Tesavrin looked at the woman and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not fear. Fear had been her companion since the fleet dropped out of fold space and found the universe empty of everything they knew. This was something else. Something she had no word for in Drevari, because the Drevari language had been designed for a people who owned 41 star systems and had never needed a word for the feeling of being small in someone else's home and being welcomed there anyway. "Your mountain is extraordinary," Tesavrin said, because she was a geologist and it was the truest thing she could say. "Thank you," Marin said, and the simplicity of it broke something open. "Would you like to see the rest?" Marin Aldrich walked Tesavrin along the ridgeline as the sun moved across the sky, and the shadows of the engineered peaks shifted in patterns that Tesavrin's trained eye recognized as deliberate, not decorative, functional. The shadows fell across the valley in a sequence that regulated temperature, directed airflow, and channeled light toward the human settlement structures below. The mountains were not just weapons and shields. They were climate regulators, energy harvesters, atmospheric processors. They were infrastructure disguised as landscape, and they had been running continuously for longer than the Drevari civilization had existed. Marin explained without lecturing. She spoke the way geologists speak to other geologists, in layers, in strata, in the patient accumulation of evidence. She showed Tesavrin the deep-core boreholes where the lattice connected to the mantle tap. She pointed out the surface formations where the defensive arrays were housed, invisible to orbital scans because they were made of the same material as the mountain itself. She described the 12,000-year engineering project that had transformed the Northern Shield Territories from a natural mountain range into a continental-scale defensive installation that could absorb and redirect the energy of an orbital bombardment. At one point, Marin stopped at a ledge where the lattice was visible through eroded surface stone, a web of dark crystalline threads spreading through pale basalt like the root system of a vast underground tree. She placed her palm against the lattice and closed her eyes. "Feel," she said. Tesavrin placed her claw beside Marin's hand. Through the stone she felt it again, the harmonic she had detected on the climb. The braided cord, the 3 frequencies, the pulse that traveled through the mountain like a living signal. But now, with Marin's hand beside hers, she felt something additional, a response. The lattice was not just transmitting, it was receiving. It was registering the pressure of their touch, both pressures, clawed and flat, and adjusting its output. The warmth beneath Tessavrin's claw increased by a fraction of a degree. The harmonics shifted pitch, almost imperceptibly, as though the mountain were tuning itself to the presence of someone new. "It knows we are here," Tessavrin said. "It knows everything is here," Marin replied. "Every footstep, every weather pattern, every change in orbital traffic. The lattice is a sensor network as much as a defense system. It feels the planet. We read what it feels." "How?" Marin opened her eyes and looked at Tessavrin with the expression of someone about to share a professional secret. "That is what geologists do on this planet. We do not study dead rock. We listen to a living world. The lattice speaks in harmonics, in thermal gradients, in stress patterns that shift when conditions change. Reading it is like reading seismic data, except the seismic data has opinions." Tessavrin almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught in her chest cartilage and became something warmer instead, the first stirring of a feeling she would eventually learn to call belonging, though she had no word for it yet. "Why?" Tessavrin asked, standing at the edge of a borehole that dropped into darkness so deep her instruments could not find the bottom. "Why did you build all of this?" Marin looked at her with an expression that Tessavrin would later recognize as the human version of patience, the same patience that had rebuilt mountains and waited 80,000 years, and still had room in it for a lost alien geologist on a ridgeline. "Because others came before you," Marin said, "and not all of them came gently." The meaning landed, and Tessavrin felt the scale of it settle into her bones. The drevari were not the first aliens to return to Earth. They were not the first to arrive expecting a primitive world. And apparently, they were not the first to arrive with weapons, even if the drevari fleet's weapons were dead and useless. The humans had been visited before, raided, invaded, tested, and each time, they had learned. Each time, they had built more. Each time, the mountains had grown deeper and stronger and more alive, until the planet itself was a single integrated defense organism that could identify a threat in orbit and respond before the threat understood what it was facing. And yet the humans had not fired on the remnant fleet. They had not activated the lattice. They had sent a single ship with a 3-sentence message: "We see you. You are not a threat. State your need." They had looked at 11 broken ships full of lost people and seen not a threat but a need. That was the thing Tessavrin could not fit into her understanding of power. Every civilization she had studied, and she had studied many, because geologists study the bones of dead worlds, and dead worlds are usually killed by the civilizations that live on them. Every powerful civilization she knew used its power to exclude, to wall off, to dominate. The humans had built the most formidable planetary defense system in recorded history, and their first response to 11 unarmed ships had been a question: "What do you need?" She sat on the ridge as the sun began to set, her instruments powered down, her field kit closed. Marin sat beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. The valley below was lit now by the glow of the human support structures and by the running lights of the drevari ships, and from this distance, the two light sources blended into a single warm constellation on the valley floor. "The stone on your 4th world," Marin said, breaking the silence. "The one your database calls Drevos Prime. I have read about it." Tessavrin turned to look at her. "You have records of Drevos Prime." "We have records of everything the drevari left behind on this planet 80,000 years ago. Survey data, geological samples, cultural artifacts. Your people were here for about 2 centuries, studying us. You cataloged quite a lot before you departed. We considered your species pre-tool." "You were correct at the time." No anger in Marin's voice. No recrimination. Statement of geological fact. "But you also left behind survey cores from Drevos Prime. Basalt samples with a crystalline structure I have always wanted to see in person. The way your homeworld's magma incorporated metallic hydrogen during cooling, it is unlike anything in our solar system. Tessavrin stared at her. This human, this representative of a civilization that could unmake continents, was talking about the geological properties of drevari basalt with the reverence of a scholar who had spent years studying something she loved from a distance. "You preserved our survey cores," Tessavrin said. "Of course, they are part of the geological record. We preserve everything. For 80,000 years. For as long as the stone lasts. Which, if properly stored, is effectively forever." Marin paused. "Would you like to see them? They are in the Northern Archive, about 400 kilometers east of here. The crystalline structure is best viewed under polarized light. I have a lab setup that I think you would appreciate." Tessavrin opened her mouth and closed it. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had lost her civilization, her homeworld, her language, and her purpose. She was sitting on an engineered mountain on a planet that should not exist, next to a woman who studied rocks from dead empires the way Tessavrin studied rocks from dead worlds, and she was being invited to a laboratory to look at basalt under polarized light. It was the most geologist thing anyone had ever said to her. "Yes," Tessavrin said, "I would like that very much." The next 4 days unfolded in fragments that Tessavrin would later arrange into a mosaic, each piece a different facet of the same impossible truth. Fragment: the medical station on the valley floor, where drevari crew members lined up for health assessments administered by human physicians who had never encountered drevari biology before but whose diagnostic equipment adapted in real time. Tessavrin watched a human doctor named Chen press a scanner against the chest of a drevari engineer and produce, in under a minute, a complete metabolic profile that identified 3 chronic conditions the fleet's own medical staff had missed. The engineer, a gruff woman named Solis who had kept the flagship's power core running through sheer stubbornness for 8 decades, sat very still on the examination table and said nothing while Chen explained the treatment options. When Chen finished, Solis looked at Tessavrin with an expression Tessavrin had never seen on her face before. It took a moment to recognize it as hope. Fragment: the communication hub, where a human linguist named Haruki was building a comprehensive drevari language database from the fleet's archival records. Haruki worked with a drevari cultural officer named Dissain, and Tessavrin stopped by their workstation on the second day to find them arguing passionately about verb conjugation in old drevari formal address. Dissain was laughing. Tessavrin realized she had not heard a drevari laugh in months. Dissain had been the fleet's historian, responsible for maintaining the cultural records that were all that remained of a dead civilization, and the weight of that responsibility had pressed her into a permanent silence. Now she was laughing about verb conjugation with a human who had learned her language in 2 days and was already correcting her pronunciation. Fragment: the engineering bay, where human technicians were examining the remnant fleet's power systems with the careful, unhurried attention of archaeologists studying ancient artifacts, which, Tessavrin realized, was exactly what they were doing. The drevari fusion cores were 80,000-year-old technology, and to the humans, they were relics fascinating, historically significant relics that deserved to be understood before they were repaired. A human engineer named Voss spent 6 hours disassembling a secondary power coupling while explaining to Solis, in patient detail, exactly how the drevari design differed from the human equivalent. Solis, who had maintained that coupling through decades of drift, listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when Voss finished, she said, "Your design is better. Your design lasted 80,000 years on minimal maintenance," Voss replied. "That is not nothing." Solis had looked away, and Tessavrin saw something glisten at the corner of her eye. Pride. The terrible, aching pride of someone who had done her best with what she had for longer than should have been possible, and was finally being seen for it. Fragment: the children's education module on the 3rd ship, where 31 drevari children between the ages of 4 and 16 had spent their entire lives learning from archived lesson plans written for a civilization that no longer existed. The fleet's education officer, a gaunt man named Trevain, had done his best with limited resources, teaching history from fragmentary databases, science from outdated manuals, literature from whatever texts had been loaded into the ship's cultural archive before the armada departed 80 millennia ago. The children knew the names of drevari cities they would never visit, the geography of a homeworld they would never see, the customs of a culture that existed only in their lessons and in the careful stories Trevain told them before lights out. A human educator named Patel had arrived on the second day with a portable learning station and a gentle, unhurried manner that the children responded to immediately. Tesseverin found them on the fourth afternoon, 31 children sitting in a semicircle on the valley floor, watching a holographic display that Patel had synced with the fleet's archived materials. The display showed Drevos Prime not as it was now, colonized and renamed, but as it had been when the armada departed. The volcanic southern rift zone. The metallic hydrogen deposits that caught the light like frozen lightning. The cities built from local basalt, their curved architecture matching the planet's geological contours. The images had been reconstructed from the survey cores and cultural artifacts in the Northern Archive. The humans had built a three-dimensional model of a dead world from the things the drevari had left behind 80,000 years ago, and they were showing it to drevari children who had never seen their homeworld. A girl named Sethri, 11 years old, sharp-featured and quiet, reached out and touched the holographic image of a Kethrin formation in the rift zone. "That is Thunderstone," she said, her voice small and precise. "Trevain showed us pictures. He said it sings when you hit it." Patel looked at Tesseverin. Tesseverin looked at the girl. She felt the weight in her chest cartilage shift and settle, the way sediment settles after a seismic event. "It does," Tesseverin said. "I will take you to hear it." Fragment, the Northern Archive. Marin took Tesseverin there on the third day, in a ground vehicle that moved across the engineered landscape with a smoothness that made Tesseverin's geologist's soul ache with admiration. The archive was built into the mountain itself, not carved from it, but grown with it, the way a tree grows around a support wire until wire and wood are indistinguishable. The corridors were stone, but stone that breathed and adjusted its temperature and humidity to protect the contents within. And the contents? Tesseverin walked through chamber after chamber of preserved geological samples, cultural artifacts, biological specimens, and recorded data, all of it collected from the hundreds of alien expeditions that had visited Earth over the past 80,000 years. The drevari section occupied 3 chambers. The first held cultural artifacts, clothing fragments, tool handles, ceramic vessels, personal effects that some long-dead drevari researcher had considered too mundane to pack when the expedition departed. Each item was mounted in a climate-controlled display with a label in 2 languages, the original drevari catalog notation, preserved exactly, and a human annotation providing context. The annotations were detailed, scholarly, and respectful. They described each artifact not as a specimen, but as a piece of someone's life. The second chamber held biological samples, preserved tissue cultures, genetic material, botanical specimens from the expedition's supply gardens. Tesseverin recognized the species, the blue-flowering dreva vine that every drevari expedition carried for morale, because the plant scent triggered a calming neurochemical response in drevari physiology. The humans had kept the vine alive, not just preserved alive. A living specimen of dreva vine grew in a contained terrarium in the center of the chamber, its blue flowers bright under the archive's soft lighting. The vine was 80,000 years old. The humans had tended it for 80,000 years, keeping alive a plant from a world that no longer belonged to the people who had planted it. Tesseverin stood in front of the terrarium and breathed in the scent of dreva flowers. It smelled like the greenhouse on the flagship, the one Trevain maintained for the children. It smelled like the laboratory on Drevos Prime where she had studied as a student. It smelled like home. The third chamber held the geological samples. When Tesseverin saw the survey cores from Drevos Prime displayed in climate-controlled cases under soft lighting, each one labeled with the original drevari catalog number, and a human annotation describing its geological significance, she stopped walking and stood very still for a long time. "You kept everything," she said. "Everything that was left behind," Marin said. "Everything that was discarded or forgotten or considered unimportant. We are a species that remembers, Tesseverin. It is perhaps our defining characteristic." Tesseverin reached out and pressed her sampling claw against the case containing a core from the Drevos Prime Southern Rift Zone. The basalt inside was shot through with metallic hydrogen crystals that caught the light like frozen lightning. She had seen cores like this in the Drevari National Geological Survey when she was a student, before the survey and the nation and the planet itself had passed into history while she drifted in fold space. She had thought she would never see Drevari stone again. "This core," she said, her voice unsteady. "The crystalline structure, metallic hydrogen incorporated during cooling, as you said. On Drevos Prime we called this formation Kethrin, Thunderstone, because when you struck it, it rang." She tapped the case lightly with one claw, and through the glass, the crystal lattice inside the core shivered and produced a single clear note that hung in the air of the archive chamber like a bell struck in a cathedral. Marin stood beside her and listened to the note fade, and when it was gone, she said, "I have wanted to hear that sound for 20 years." Tesseverin looked at her. 20 years. "I wrote my doctoral thesis on Drevari volcanic petrology. Theoretical, of course. I had never handled actual Drevari samples. The cores in the archive are too precious to use for student research. But I modeled the acoustic properties of Kethrin mathematically, and I predicted that note." She paused. "I was wrong by about a quarter tone. The real thing is more beautiful." Tesseverin felt the tears before she understood them. They were not grief, though grief was part of it, grief for Drevos Prime, for the Southern Rift Zone, for the student she had been when she first heard Thunderstone ring in a lecture hall that no longer existed. The tears were something older than grief. They were the recognition that a piece of her world had survived, not because the Drevari had protected it, but because a species they had dismissed as primitive had found it worthy of preservation and study and love. She wiped her face with the back of her foreclaw and said, "Show me your thesis." Marin showed her the thesis. Fragment: the fourth day the meeting. Commander Vashin convened the fleet's senior officers and department heads in the largest of the human-built structures on the valley floor. The structure was a meeting hall, circular, with walls of that same engineered stone that Tesseverin now recognized as the planet's signature material. Human representatives were present. A tall man named Director Calloway, who appeared to hold administrative authority over the region. Commander Wren, who had been coordinating the fleet's logistics. Marin, who sat near Tesseverin with her field notebook open on her knee, and 3 others whose roles Tesseverin did not fully understand but whose bearing suggested significant responsibility. Vashin stood at the center of the circle and spoke with the rigid composure of an officer delivering a report he did not want to deliver. "The 6th Expeditionary Armada of the Drevari Sovereignty no longer exists," he said. "The sovereignty no longer exists. The Drevari homeworld of Drevos Prime was colonized by the Tesseran Compact approximately 42,000 years ago. Our colonies have been absorbed by 17 different political entities, none of which recognize Drevari territorial claims. Our language is classified as extinct. Our species is listed in galactic census records as residual population, no known active communities. We are, as far as the galaxy is concerned, already gone." He paused. The silence in the chamber was total. This fleet 11 ships, 4,107 crew, is the last organized drevari population in existence. We have no home. We have no allies. We have no resources beyond what sits on the valley floor. We have no weapons, no political standing, and no claim on anyone's protection or hospitality. Tesserin watched the human faces as Vashon spoke. Director Calloway's expression was grave and attentive. Wren's was unreadable. Marin's was something Tesserin was learning to recognize, a particular kind of human stillness that was not passivity but active listening, the geological patience of a species that measured time in millennia. Vashon straightened. "We request asylum." The word landed in the chamber like the thunderstone note in the archive, a single clear sound that changed the air. Tesserin watched the drevari officers absorb the word. Some of them had known it was coming. Others, younger officers, crew who had spent the 19 days since arrival focused on repairs and supplies, and the daily mechanics of keeping 4,000 people alive, looked stunned. The word asylum carried weight in drevari. It was not a neutral term. It meant the formal acknowledgement that one's own sovereignty had failed, that one existed now within someone else's protection, that the ship of state had foundered, and the survivors were swimming for a shore they did not own. Lieutenant Pelith, the scan officer who had first detected the planet's occupied status, sat rigid in his chair with his hands flat on his thighs. Tesserin could see the tendons in his six-fingered hands straining. Pelith was 24. He had been born on the flagship. He had never set foot on a planet before this week. The concept of asylum, of having a home to lose, was purely theoretical for him. He had grown up in a metal corridor hurtling through fold space, and the only ground he had ever walked on was engineered stone that belonged to someone else. Rithane, the fleet's chief tactical officer, sat with her arms folded and her burn-scarred hands tucked against her ribs. Her face was blank, but Tesserin had known her for 20 years and recognized the particular quality of that blankness. It was the expression Rithane wore when she was holding something down inside herself by force. Rithane had been a junior officer when the armada entered fold space. She remembered the departure. She remembered the homeworld they were leaving behind, and the orders they were following, and the certainty they all shared that the armada would return in glory after the campaign. She had spent 80,000 years waiting to go home, and now she was sitting in a chamber made of alien stone, listening to her commander ask for permission to stay. Director Calloway did not respond immediately. He looked at the drevari officers arranged around the circle, tired faces, worn uniforms, the careful dignity of people who had held themselves together through 80,000 years of nothing, and were now, finally, asking for help. "Commander Vashon," Calloway said, "we have been preparing for this conversation since your fleet entered our system 19 days ago. I want you to understand what that means." He gestured, and one of his aides produced a display that projected into the center of the circle. It showed a document, dense, detailed, annotated, that Tesserin's translator identified as a resettlement framework. "In the 19 days since your arrival, we have surveyed your fleet's population, assessed your species' biological and environmental requirements, identified compatible settlement zones on 3 continents, and drafted a provisional integration plan that includes housing, medical care, educational resources, cultural preservation facilities, and geological survey positions for your scientific staff." Calloway looked at Tesserin when he said the last part, and she felt the specificity of it like a hand reaching out. "We did not do this because we were required to. We did it because we remembered you." "Remembered us," Vashon repeated. "Your people spent 2 centuries on this planet. You studied us, cataloged our biosphere, collected samples, filed reports. You treated us as subjects of academic interest, and then you left because we were not worth staying for." Calloway's voice was even without rancor. "We have had 80,000 years to think about what it means when someone leaves. We have had visitors who came with weapons, visitors who came with demands, visitors who came with contempt. We learned from all of them. We built from all of them. And we decided, a very long time ago, that when someone came to us with nothing, with no weapons, no demands, no contempt, only need, we would answer that need. Because that is what we wished someone had done for us, in the years when we were small and alone and no one stayed. The chamber was silent. Tessavrin looked at the faces of her people, officers, engineers, scientists, crew, and saw the same expression on everyone. Not relief, not gratitude, recognition. The recognition of a truth they had spent 80,000 years circling without ever finding the words for. That home was not a planet or a coordinate or a claim staked in stone. Home was the place where someone remembered you and chose to keep a place for you anyway. Vashan stood very still for a long time. Tessavrin watched his face and saw the last piece of the old world, the commander's world, the armada's world, the world of expansion corridors and strategic waypoints and species catalogued by threat assessment, release its grip on him. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His jaw unclenched. He looked, for the first time since Tessavrin had known him, like a man rather than an officer. "We accept," he said. Rithane's blank expression cracked, just slightly, just at the corners of her mouth and the edges of her eyes, the way stone cracks when water finds its way inside and freezes and expands and makes room for something new to grow. She said nothing. She did not need to. The crack was enough. Pelith's hands relaxed on his thighs. He looked down at them as though noticing for the first time that they had been clenched, and then he looked up at the engineered stone walls of the chamber, and then out through the open entrance at the valley, where the drevari ship sat among the human structures. And Tessavrin saw something settle in his face that she recognized, because she had felt it herself on the ridgeline. The first tentative understanding that the ground beneath him might hold. Fragment, the 5th day, the walk. Tessavrin hiked the western ridge again, this time with Marin beside her. They carried matching field kits, Tessavrin's drevari instruments alongside Marin's human equivalents, and they worked the ridgeline together, sampling, scanning, comparing readings, debating the engineering tolerances of the defensive lattice the way colleagues debate the merits of competing theories. At the 700-meter mark, they stopped at the same shelf where they had first met, and Tessavrin ran her spectrometer over a formation she had been studying since day one. The carbon silicate lattice was denser here, more complex, with branching patterns that her instruments mapped as a fractal distribution network. "This formation," Tessavrin said, "the lattice density peaks at this elevation and then decreases toward the summit." "Why?" Marin crouched beside her and ran her own scanner over the formation. "Thermal regulation. This elevation is the equilibrium point between the mantle tap below and the atmospheric interface above. The lattice concentrates here because this is where the energy is managed, where the mountain decides whether to heat or cool, defend or rest. The mountain decides. In a sense, the lattice is responsive, not sentient but adaptive. It reacts to conditions, seismic activity, atmospheric pressure, orbital threat signatures. It has been running for 12,000 years without maintenance because it was designed to maintain itself." Tessavrin pressed her claw against the formation and felt the warmth again. The same warmth she had felt on the first day, when she had scored the surface and watched it heal. The warmth of a planet that had been engineered to endure, to adapt, to remember. "On Drevos Prime," she said quietly, "the mountains did not do this. They were just mountains. Basalt and granite and the occasional Kethrin deposit, beautiful but passive. They did not heal. They did not decide. They were stone, and eventually they eroded, and that was the story." Marin was quiet beside her. "I spent my career studying dead stone on dead worlds," Tessavrin continued. "The remnants of geology that no longer functions, fossil strata, extinct volcanism, the bones of planets that have finished doing whatever they were going to do. I became very good at reading endings. The final eruption. The last tectonic shift. The moment a world's geology goes quiet and stays quiet. She pulled her claw back from the formation and looked at the valley below, where the drevari ships sat among the human structures, two sets of lights in the gathering dusk. I do not know how to read a world that is still becoming, she said. A world that is still building itself, still growing, still deciding what it wants to be. Your planet is not finished, Marin. It is not a fossil or a relic or a monument. It is alive in a way that I have no professional framework for. Then build one, Marin said. Tessavrin looked at her. Build a new framework. You are a geologist on a planet that has never been properly studied by a drevari geologist before. The lattice, the mantle taps, the defensive formations, no one with your species' geological perspective has ever analyzed them. Your instruments read frequencies that ours miss. Your sampling claws detect resonances that our equipment cannot register. You heard the thunderstone sing through a sealed display case. You felt the lattice's thermal signature through your forelimb before your spectrometer confirmed it. You bring something to this work that we do not have. She stood and looked out at the mountains, the endless, engineered, living mountains that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The Northern Shield territories are 412,000 square kilometers of integrated defensive geology, Marin said. I have been surveying them for 31 years, and I have barely scratched the surface. Literally, I could use a colleague who knows how to read stone from the inside out. Tessavrin stared at her. You are offering me a position. I am offering you a purpose. The position is incidental. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, and the lattice in the mountain around them responded to the shift in light by adjusting its energy output, warming the stone beneath their feet as the air cooled. Tessavrin felt the warmth rise through her claws, through her legs, into the dense cartilage of her chest, where drevari kept their deepest feelings, the ones that were too heavy for the brain, and had to be stored closer to the center of mass. She thought of Drevos Prime, the southern rift zone, where she had first learned to read stone. The thunderstone deposits that rang when you struck them, a sound like a world announcing itself. She would never stand on Drevos Prime again. She would never hear Kethryn sing from the source. That world was gone, occupied by strangers, its geological heritage dismantled for raw materials by a species that did not know what thunderstone sounded like and did not care. But here, on a planet that the drevari had once dismissed as primitive, a human woman had spent 20 years studying drevari basalt from preserved survey cores. A human civilization had kept those cores for 80 millennia, filed and labeled and protected, waiting for someone who knew their names. And now that someone was here, standing on a mountain that could heal itself, being offered a purpose by a colleague who wanted to hear thunderstone ring. Home was not a planet. Home was the place where your work mattered and someone wanted to do it with you. Yes, Tessavrin said, I will stay. Marin nodded. No ceremony, no speeches, the acknowledgement of one professional accepting another into a shared practice, the most geologist way to welcome someone home. They stood on the ridgeline as the last light faded and the lattice warmed the stone beneath them. And below in the valley, the lights of two peoples burned together in the dark, indistinguishable now from a distance, like a single settlement built by a single community that had always been there. Fragment, the sixth day, the discovery. Tessavrin was in Marin's laboratory at the Northern Archive, running polarized light analysis on the Drevos Prime survey cores, when she found it. The core was from the Southern Rift Zone, a deep extraction sample pulled from 600 meters below the surface of a Kethryn-bearing basalt formation. Standard drevari geological survey procedure. Drill, extract, catalog, move on. The core had been in the archive for 80,000 years, sealed in its original drevari sample case, untouched since the day some nameless drevari technician had pulled it from the ground and decided it was not interesting enough to study further. Tessavrin put it under the polarized light rig, and began a systematic scan of the crystalline structure. The metallic hydrogen inclusions glowed under polarization, bright threads of frozen lightning woven through dark basalt. She had seen thousands of cores like this in her student days. She knew what the pattern should look like. This one was different. The metallic hydrogen inclusions were not random. They were arranged in a lattice with the same branching fractal geometry as the human defensive lattice that ran through the northern shield territories. Tesserin sat very still. She recalibrated the rig and scanned again. The pattern held. She ran a mathematical comparison between the natural metallic hydrogen lattice in the drevari core and the engineered carbon silicate lattice in the human mountains. The geometries were not identical, but they were related. The same underlying mathematics, the same fractal distribution logic, as though someone had looked at the natural structure of drevari basalt and used it as a template, a starting point, a seed for the engineering that had transformed Earth's mountains into a continental defense system. Her hands were shaking. She called Marin. Marin arrived in 7 minutes, looked at the scan, looked at the comparison, sat down in the chair next to Tesserin, and was quiet for a long time. "Your people left these cores 80,000 years ago," Marin said finally. "And someone in the early days of the lattice program studied them, studied the metallic hydrogen geometry, used it as a model. Your defensive lattice is based on drevari geology," Tesserin said. She was having difficulty keeping her voice steady. "The most powerful planetary defense system in existence, built on a foundation of stone from Drevos Prime. Built on a foundation of stone that the drevari considered unimportant enough to leave behind," Marin said quietly. "The thing you discarded became the thing that protected us, for 12,000 years." They looked at each other across the laboratory bench, two geologists confronting a truth that was bigger than either of them. The drevari had come to Earth 80,000 years ago, studied the planet's primitive inhabitants, collected samples, filed reports, and left. They had considered the humans beneath notice. They had not imagined that the species they dismissed would one day build a fortress planet that could stand against any threat in the galaxy. And they certainly had not imagined that the architectural foundation of that fortress would be drawn from survey cores the drevari themselves had drilled and discarded on the way out the door. The humans had taken what was left behind and built the extraordinary from it, not in spite of the drevari, not against them, from them. The drevari contribution to Earth's defense, unconscious, unintended, dismissed as trivial at the time, was woven into the bones of the planet, running through every mountain in the northern shield territories, humming in the lattice that kept the world safe. "We are part of this planet," Tesserin said, and her voice broke on the last word. "You always were," Marin said. "You just did not know it yet." Tesserin pressed her claw against the survey core in its sealed case. Through the glass, through 80,000 years, she felt the faintest vibration. Thunderstone singing in the dark. Fragment the 7th day. Tesserin stood on the western ridge at dawn, watching the sun rise over the northern shield territories. The lattice in the mountain beneath her feet was cycling into its daytime configuration, drawing energy from the first light, distributing warmth through the engineered strata, preparing for the day with the patient efficiency of a system that had done this 12,000 times a year for 12,000 years. Below her in the valley, the drevari fleet was being repaired. Human engineers worked alongside drevari crew, the two groups moving around the old ships with the coordinated ease of people who had been working together for longer than 7 days. Tesserin could see Salis directing a team of humans and drevari who were replacing a hull plate on the flagship, her voice carrying across the valley floor in a mix of drevari technical jargon and newly learned human terms. She could see Dissane and Haruki walking between the ships with a recording device, documenting the fleet's history in a joint project that would become part of the Northern Archive. She could see Dr. Chen's medical station, where a line of drevari crew members waited for follow-up assessments, with the resigned patience of people who had spent 80,000 years avoiding doctors and were now, finally, being seen. Commander Vashon stood at the edge of the valley, looking up at the mountains. Tesserin had seen him there every morning since the meeting. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his face turned toward the engineered peaks, and she thought she knew what he was doing. He was reading the mountains the way a commander reads a strategic landscape. He was learning the terrain of his people's new home. Marin appeared beside Tesserin on the ridge, carrying 2 cups of something warm. She handed one to Tesserin. The cup was made of engineered stone, the same material as the mountains, the archive walls, the meeting hall. It was warm in Tesserin's claws. "Tea," Marin said. "A human beverage. Heated leaf water, essentially. I do not know if your biology will find it palatable, but the warmth is the point." Tesserin wrapped her claws around the cup and felt the warmth sink into her forelimbs, her chest, the cartilage where she kept her heaviest feelings. The tea smelled green and sharp, like rain on basalt. She drank. It was strange and bitter and alive, like the planet itself. "I have been thinking about your thesis," Tesserin said. "The one on drevari volcanic petrology." "You modeled the acoustic properties of Kethrin from first principles, without ever handling a sample. You predicted the resonant frequency within a quarter tone. That is exceptional work." "Thank you." "But your model assumed a uniform crystalline density throughout the formation. Real Kethrin has density variations that create harmonic overtones. The single note you heard in the archive, the note you predicted, was only the fundamental. In a natural Kethrin deposit, if you strike the stone correctly, you can produce a chord. 3 notes, sometimes 4. Marin turned to look at her, and Tesserin saw the particular light that enters a scientist's eyes when they encounter a piece of knowledge they did not have and immediately understand that it changes everything. "A chord," Marin said. "I can show you. If we go back to the archive and I adjust the angle of percussion on the core sample, I can produce the secondary harmonics. Your polarized light rig should be able to visualize the crystal lattice vibrations in real time." Marin was already reaching for her field bag. "Let us go now." They hiked down the ridge together, 2 geologists moving with the purpose of people who have work to do, stepping over engineered stone that hummed beneath their feet. The sun was fully up now, warming the mountains, feeding the lattice, lighting the valley where 2 peoples were building something that did not have a name yet but was beginning, in the slow geological way of things that last, to feel like home. Behind them, on the ridge, the stone they had stood on held the warmth of their passing for a long time. The lattice recorded the pressure of their footsteps, both kinds, clawed and flat, drevari and human, and filed them in its memory alongside 80,000 years of wind and rain and the footsteps of everyone who had ever walked there. The mountain remembered. The mountain always remembered. And now it had something new to remember. The sound of 2 people walking in the same direction, their instruments clinking against their packs, their voices carrying across the stone as they argued about crystalline density and harmonic overtones, the old language of rock and time, and the patient work of understanding what the ground beneath your feet is trying to tell you. That was the story the mountain would keep. Not the fleet, not the asylum, not the politics or the history or the 80,000 years of separation. The story of 2 geologists who found each other on a ridgeline and discovered that the stone they loved was the same stone, that the work they did was the same work, and that home was not a place you returned to but a place you built together, one stratum at a time, until the foundation was deep enough to hold.